Hey everybody, we're here to have our first Zoom lecture. Bear with me, I'm relatively new to the technology. It's not too hard though. Anyway, we'll be talking today about time series with ARIMA. We started talking about that a little bit the last time we met in person, but I'll just take it from the top because I'm sure a lot of stuff's been going on that has left you a little bit distracted. All right, so time series analysis. What are we doing with time series? We're analyzing data collected over a number of multiple observations. It's going to be different than procedures like paired t-test or repeated measures ANOVA, where you might have people measure twice or 3 or 4 times, as we're having measures over a substantial number of time points. We have a new assumption, which is the absence of autocorrelations, or more specifically, the absence of autocorrelated residuals. That's almost always violated, and I'll talk more about that in some detail. We'll look at several approaches to testing assumptions, and ultimately that will take us away from using regression and into using what's called ARIMA. ARIMA stands for autoregressive, that's the A and the R, integrated and moving average. We'll focus only on autoregressive, integrated, and moving average pieces are a little bit more complex and probably would be more the sort of thing you'd handle in a course dedicated to longitudinal models. Before we go on, I just want to have a few points. First, I would encourage people not to try to get through all of these slides at once. I've set this up very much like resources such as DataCamp, where I'll do a little bit of talking, and then there's exercises for you to do, and some demos in R. So I'll talk about those pieces and walk you through a little bit of that as we get to them. So ideally, you're going to have a chunk of me talking, then you'll stop, try a few things out in R, and then move on to other topics. Ideally, this would be broken into small 20-minute videos. I don't know if I've got the capacity to do that right now, but as we move forward, I'll try to put these into more bite-sized chunks. Do keep in mind that the video, you should feel free to stop it, take a break, or to stop, or to do half an hour, come back at some other point. Really, however you want to go through it. I do encourage you, though, definitely do stop and do the exercises. Things are going to be a lot more clear if you do that. I also want to remind people that there's also handouts, lab assignments, lab reviews that are really almost an R manual for doing a lot of different analyses, lots of examples there. So there'll be more in. So I would certainly encourage people to use those resources as well for more information on the topic. All right, so some new terms. One new term is lag, and that's really something that's relevant to our there we go, relevant to our new assumption, which is the absence of autocorrelations. This really relies on, this assumption really relies on the idea that we have no relationship between 1 week's score and the next week's score. Technically, that's going to be an assumption that's related to the residuals, as it was in regression, but we'll talk about lags just as lags and lag variables, and then I get into the more details later. To meet this assumption, or to test the assumption, I should say, we actually correlate variables with themselves. It's not helpful to correlate a variable directly with itself, because if you're correlating something with itself, it's just going to be correlated at 1.0. But what we are correlating with is over time. For example, a lagged variable would be a variable that's simply the regular variable that's been moved forward 1 point in time. What that allows us to do is get correlations between time 1 and time 2 and time 3, and so on. Similarly, we could have a 2-week lag, which would allow us to get correlations between the week 1 scores and the week 3 scores. And it goes on and on and on and on. You can get a whole wide range of different lags. And again, like with regression, it's not really the lag that we address, but rather the lagged residual that's relevant to our assumptions. We'll get to the lag residual a little bit later, but first I just want to kind of give a little bit of a demo on what a lag looks like. And I'm not fucking recording, am I? Nope. Want to take that out? Oop. My apologies, I thought we weren't recording for a second. There we go. So from the handout, here's a little table that was in the handout. The lag is a way that we can assess how a variable correlates with itself across time. And that's what we call an autocorrelation. The variable is simply called people is the original variable. And then you can see what the 1 week lag looks like, a 2 week lag looks like. So you can see for the final week, we've got people 44, lag 1 is 39. That would be the previous week's score. So we're getting a correlation between week 12 and week 11. And then similarly, for the second lag on the 12th week, we're getting a correlation between 44. We could get a correlation between 44 and 53. That's the correlation for 2 weeks. But we could add lag 3, lag 4, lag 5, lag 6, on and on and on and on and on. The assumption that we're dealing with is simply that we don't have an autocorrelation. That is, those weekly numbers what happens 1 week don't correlate with what happens the next week. That is something that we'll see is often violated. All right. Throughout the slides, I'm going to provide some R demos and occasionally a few exercises. Definitely stop and do these. You need a break from listening to me, and it will definitely help you better understand the materials. I think that this is a really nice feature of having an online setup, is that we can do that, whereas it wouldn't necessarily be all that great in the lecture format. So open RStudio, and there's a file called Time Series Examples and Demos that's available. It's on the shared drive and also on Canvas. And I want you to follow the instructions and run a demo showing you what lags look like. That's called example 1. And then I'll direct you back to this file for other exercises in a couple places. Let me just show you what this file looks like. There's some stuff up front just to make some variables. You do need the package hmisc here. So if you don't have that, certainly download that. And then it runs you through the making lags. It's not necessarily important that we know how to make lags, but viewing them, seeing what it looks like, and then seeing that we can get a correlation between them is a big piece. In these files, I've got some comments and things. So here, what I'm asking you to do is stop, run through example number 1 so you get a better sense of what lags are, and then we'll move forward. All right, now that you've gone and done that example, we'll take a look at running time series through regression. And one way I always think about this is really just talking about why regression is not going to work here. We're going to run regression on some real data. These were data that were collected by one of my former grad students, Christina Domelio. And Christina was interested in the effectiveness in harm reduction programs. She specifically was working with a needle exchange program in Eureka, and we were predicting the number of people, the number of needles exchanged, or the number of people coming to exchange needles before and after various policy changes took place. This was actually an article that was that ended up being published. I'll post onto Canvas a copy of that article. So we've got as our variable over 60 weeks or so number of people coming into the clinic to exchange hypodermic needles. And then we have another variable which represents whether this was the week was before or after a policy change. So at one point a policy change did occur. That policy change was one that required people to make an appointment to exchange needles, and some folks within the organization were looking for some data and some proof that that was something that was greatly limiting the amount of needles exchanged. So one thing we can do, it's always a good idea, graph the relationship. So we graph the relationship here, and I think that we can see right off the bat, there seems to be a big dip. You can see that around week 65 or so, I believe that's when the policy change took place. And you can see that the number of visits went down dramatically because, well, people who have a need for hypodermic needles and are intravenous drug users sometimes maybe aren't that good at making appointments, I guess. All right, so here I've just got some output from running regression, and you can see what this looks like. We can run a regression here, just predicting the number of people that came into exchange from that pre-post variable, which was a zero, a 0 before, a 1 after. So as we move from the time before to the time after the policy change, we see we have a negative slope suggesting that, yeah, exchanges did go down. It's significant. However, let's take a look at what the regression assumptions look like. I think one thing you can see here is that we've got some challenges with the regression assumptions. We see on the left-hand side, that would probably represent the after, because there's fewer cases, really small spread in terms of the residuals, whereas the before, we have a bigger spread in terms of the residuals, so that would be an indication that heteroskedasticity is a problem. We similarly have a problem with normality. We can see the residuals are also non-normal. Not really much we can do here. You know, transformations are probably not going to help us out of this this mess. All right, again, I'd like you to stop and complete example 2 and exercise 1. Let me just bring those up briefly to show you those look like. So in example 2, we're going to run a regression, and there's some information there. There's also a graph there, an approach for graphing. And then I have a small exercise where we're running our own analyses. These were data that originally would have been part of lab number 6. So run your own analysis predicting the variable arrested adjustment. Sorry, it doesn't say what it is here, but I believe the variable is called policy. Let me pause this video and make a clarification there for you. Oops. All right, folks. Oh, we're lucky enough to have a visitor. This is my cat, Diego. He's in the garage here with me. He came up to say hi, see what was up. Anyway, I just wanted to clarify on that analysis that we're predicting arrest adjustment from a variable called law pre-post. So you'll find that right here. There we go. And I've amended the file to have that. Sorry about that. Anyway, so that's what we're going to be predicting it from. So that's your exercise. So I encourage all of you to stop, go back, stop, go over to R, run those analyses, kind of get a feel for some of these different pieces, and then we'll pick up in a minute. All right. All right, just getting set up again. Sorry, it's a little challenging jumping between all of these different pieces, plus the cat wants to be let out. All right, testing assumptions. How are we going to test assumptions? There's 4 different strategies that we can use to test assumptions. People do different things. I certainly have my own opinions as to which are the right things. Give me one sec. There you go. I certainly have my own opinions on which things should be used, but we'll see that a lot of people do use different things. a few options. There's what's called the Durbin-Watson test. It's a significance test for residuals. There's simply running correlations between lagged residuals. Autocorrelation function graphs, that's probably the one that I usually land on. Boxlong test for significance of lags or cumulative significance lags. I really, for my, to me, the ACF approach is the one to go, the autocorrelation function graphs. We'll see that we need to run a few different graphs there, but I'll go through each of the different things because these are different things that you'll encounter. All right. So residual autocorrelation. There we go. All right, folks. So all of these tests focus on residual autocorrelations. These are simply predicted scores minus the actual score, or y minus y prime values, just like we had with regression. What we're actually looking at is the correlation between the residual and a lagged residual. We'll see that some tests just look at the first lag, but other tests look at lags 1, 2, 3, 4, a whole bunch of them. And those are generally the better tests. Remember, as with regression and as with just about everything, it's the residuals that we want to examine, not the raw scores. So we're doing the same piece here. All right, the Durbin-Watson test. Durbin-Watson is a significance test that tests the relationship between a residual and its lag. We want it to be non-significant. A significant Durbin-Watson value would indicate that we have a significant autocorrelation. This is the one that we have to the right, and you'll have examples of how to run this in the R file. The one that we have on the right is not significant, so this would suggest that there is no problem with autocorrelations here. One of the big issues that we have here is that it only tests the first lag. Autocorrelations actually can address additional lags. A 2-week lag, a 3-week lag, a 4-week lag. One concern we had with the data that, with these data, with the needle exchange data, was that people might have been getting enough needles to last for a few weeks. So, between 1 week and another, that might not be the issue that we're really trying to address. Another technique, this is probably one of the first ones, is to examine correlations between our lagged residuals and not worry about it unless it's 0.3 or higher, or an absolute value of 0.3. More than, less than negative 0.3 is a problem as well. A good rule of thumb here is that rules of thumb like this are almost always wrong. We see here we have no correlation between the residual and the lag of the residual. Again, that's for the first residual. We could do this for multiple lags, but it's kind of a pain to do. And I think that most folks would say that 0.3 criteria, probably extraordinarily liberal, which in this case means it never really shows that there is a problem, or never suggests that there's a problem. All right, autocorrelation function graphs. These are graphs that represent a large number of autocorrelations, basically however many lags you can calculate things for. And we have 2 general rules. One, the first 3 lags should have a correlation to standard error ratio of about 1.25. The remaining ones should have that ratio of about 1.6. Now, the tools that we have in R actually don't easily show us the actual correlation and its standard error, but we can actually jiggle these graphs in a way that we can get bars that show us those 2 different criteria. So we're going to get 2 graphs actually using 2 different criteria. One corresponds to roughly a t of 1.25. That's that correlation to standard error ratio of 1.25. And then the other corresponds to about an 89% confidence interval, a T of 1.6. So roughly 80 and 90% confidence intervals that we're looking at. And what we're trying to look for those first 3 lags, any of them that are above that 1.25 mark would be a problem. And for the subsequent lags, any of the ones that are above that 1.6 mark would be a problem. Now, this approach requires us to write a little bit of code, not that big a deal once you have it written, once you have it worked out. A couple things that I would say about this approach. One, if there are logical reasons why you might be, you might expect correlations after the 4th or the 5th or the 6th lag, a pattern like that, then that certainly would suggest that we might want to use the more stringent 1.25 criteria. For example, if you had something that was weekly, measured every day, there might be some weekly patterns. So you might look at the first 7 lags. We'll just use the first 3 lags, because that's the general rule. But there might be some situations where you might want to do it differently. So here is a graph that we'll use for the first 3 lags, although it shows all of them. The first piece that you see looks really big, and that's actually a correlation of 1, and that's the lag correlated with itself, its unlagged self. So that one you can ignore. That one always jumps out and looks big. The first lag is actually the one that's the second over, so you can see that one, and I'm pointing with my hand, and that doesn't help you at all, does it? So if you see the first line that goes up to 1, jump over to the next one. That's slightly negative. That was that like negative 0.02 or whatever value that we saw when we did the correlation directly. Then the second lag, we can see that that's above those lines, and what that means is that it is exceeding the confidence interval limits, and we do have a problem. And we can see the third one, maybe exceeds that or is right up against it. So that might be a problem as well. The second graph is for the remaining lags. We can see that for the 6th and looks like the 8th lag, we're exceeding that. Then somewhere down the line, like the 14th or 15th, the 13th and 14th look to be a problem. I'm not so much concerned with those later ones unless there is an obvious reason for there being a 13-week lag. That might just be noise, and that tends to get cleared up a little bit as we start to do adjustments. The last approach is the Boxlong test, and this addresses significance, and it does it for multiple lags in a cumulative way. Problematically, we have to run this in a number of different ways in order to get all of the values. So for the first one, we see a very small value. Tells us there's no problem. That's probably very much equivalent to what we saw with the correlation when we did that with the first lag. The second one isn't a test of the second lag. It's a test of the cumulative autocorrelation between the first and the second. We can see Boxlong says, hey, there's no problem. And then the third one, again, that's a cumulative test. We can see that that's not significant. I don't really recommend this approach, but it is a widely used one, so you will see it. I just think it's got some problems. All right, so now I want you to go over to example 3 and exercise 2. Again, we'll bring those up and we'll sorry, let me share my screen. All right, so example 3 is playing around with the different autocorrelation approaches. You can see code for doing all of those. We need the package called LM test to carry out the Durbin-Watson. And then you can see some other approaches, building lags as we did before, but here we're lagging the residuals and then getting a correlation. You can see the ACF graph. ACF graph, I would say, definitely the way to go. That's probably the one that you'll be using the most. And then you can see the Boxlong test and specifying the different lags as how we get a series of them. Usually people might report up to 6 of them or something like that. And then in exercise 2, I'm having you again use that drunken public data set and address the autocorrelations there. Again, with these exercises, you don't have to turn them, you don't have to turn them in, but I think they will be really, really helpful in terms of getting you to understand these materials, particularly since we're not having lab assignments anymore. All right, let me go back to PowerPoint slides. There we go. All right. So how do we deal with autocorrelations? ARIMA is the procedure that we would use to deal with autocorrelations. It provides adjustments to the variables that account for autocorrelations. And again, it does more than just autocorrelations. That's the A and the R in the name. Integrated moving average are the I, M, and A's. But again, that's for more advanced courses focusing on longitudinal methods. ARIMA will add what is basically a new variable to the data set, or to your analysis at least, representing an autocorrelative term. And this is something that basically adjusts for that autocorrelation. It takes it out of the equation. This will tend to take explained variance away from your predictor variable. So that's one effect that it's going to have, but it's going to give you an analysis that actually meets assumptions eventually. Now, probably the best way to work with ARIMA is just to try to work through it and run multiple analyses until you actually meet assumptions. So what we're going to do is we're going to run our first ARIMA. We're going to examine our assumptions. If the assumptions didn't get dealt with, then we're going to add an additional term until we can meet the assumptions. So, and you'll see how these are all run in a little bit. What I did is I ran the ARIMA analysis. You can think of this as just a different version of regression, very much like what we've done, except it's adding in this, this new term. The ARIMA 100 designation, that's just how many autocorrelative terms, 1, integrated terms, 0, moving average terms, 0. The last 2 zeros will always be there because we're not dealing with those aspects. That 1 will change to a 2 when we work for a second autoregressive term, a 3 when we work for a third, and so on. These are the 2 graphs that we get. On the left, I'm going to have the 1.25 criteria, the right, the 1.6 criteria. We see for our first lag, there's really nothing there. There's no correlation, but that second lag is still problematic. And the third lag appears still problematic. And then for the second graph, as we look to the one labeled 1.60 on the right-hand side, we also have issues down the line with lag 6, looks like lag 8 maybe, some of the later ones. So what we're going to do with ARIMA is we're going to say, okay, didn't meet the assumption here. Now I'm going to go back and I'm going to add another autoregressive term. Just to show you why I don't like Boxlong, you can see here Boxlong shows that there's no problem. It's a very, very liberal test. So even though we had that big autocorrelation for 2 and a pretty big one for 3, Boxlong is saying, hey, there's no problem. And that's largely based on the cumulative nature of this, because that first one didn't have any problem. So it kind of it all averages out to no problem. But I would say that the other criteria that we're using, what's commonly called the Pancrantz criteria, does show an issue. Here's what we look like once we add a second autoregressive term. One thing that you can see is that second lag now is now almost invisible on the left-hand side of the graph, well, on both sides of the graph, but that second lag, remember the first one that you see is actually lag 0, which means the variable correlated with itself. The first one's very, very small. The second one almost doesn't exist. The third one, though, still problematic, still up above that criteria. And then we can see with The second graph, the one on the right, we still do have some down the road problems. So at this point, what I would tend to do is say, okay, 2 lags didn't work. Let's go with a third. Now, when we've got our third lag, we can say, okay, all 3 of those first 3 lags all fit within our criteria. For the second graph, we still have 1 or 2 problems. We've got a 6-week lag that's over the criteria, maybe week 13 or so. At this point, we want to ask, is there any reasonable explanation for that? If not, we can probably say, this is probably good enough. If there is a reasonable explanation, like people are limited to coming in every 6 weeks, then we would certainly want to address those autocorrelations as well. So here's the analysis that I end up with. Keep in mind that the basic strategy here was we run the analysis, and we don't really even look at it. We just look at it to test the assumptions. And now we can actually interpret the analysis. In this analysis, you'll see right off the bat, there's 3 things: AR1, AR2, AR3. Those are the autoregressive terms that we've added. We're not really interested in reporting those, except to say that there's 3 autocorrelative terms. It gives us an intercept, which in the context here isn't really important. And then hand 8, pre-post. That is the regression coefficient. It's an unstandardized coefficient. It's the regression coefficient, and below it, it is the standard error. Now, for some reason, the ARIMA output doesn't give us a significance test, but it gives us all of the stuff that we need for a significance test. If we wanted to get a t-value to test whether our predictor was significant, that would simply be the coefficient, -33, over the standard error, 2.56 and stuff. That comes out to almost 13, which is a really, really big value. I've got some code that will calculate probabilities here for you, but I know that t-value of 13 is gigantic. In general, anything over about 2 is going to be significant with a reasonable sample size. So I'm pretty confident in saying that's going to be a statistically significant result. And you can see the code down below that I used. There's also some demonstrations of this in the handout, and I think in the lab assignment. Again, those lab assignments, you're not required to do those assignments anymore, but they are there for you if you want to. Well, they are there for you to review how to do different analyses. They're almost manuals for doing these different analyses. In terms of writing this up in APA style, I would just give the coefficient and its probability. Requiring appointments, reduce the number of people served at the clinic. Pretty simple, plain English conclusion. Model included 3 autocorrelative terms. So you want to mention something about those autocorrelations there. All right, now I'd like folks to stop and do exercise 3. I'll just show you exercise 3 briefly if I remember to share the screen. There we go. So exercise 3 has you use ARIMA on the drunken public data set. It says do exercise 3. There's also an example 5 here. So I'd encourage you to do that as well. Exercise 3. Use ARIMA with, again, the drunken public data set. Keep adding autocorrelations until you meet the different assumptions. All right, and that's it for the different exercises and examples that we have. I'll run you through a few different versions of a few different additional versions of these analyses before we go. Well, before I go. All right, I showed you an example where we had a categorical predictor. We can certainly use continuous predictors here. Here we're going to look at how needle exchanges and how the number of exchanges being made related to a particular problem that the clinic was having, which was treating people with abscesses. Abscesses are a common physical problem for people who use intravenous drugs. They're common in infection sites. They can be very difficult to treat. They can become very serious infections, and the clinic spends a great deal of money on treating these. Clean needles is one way that you can avoid these infections. So we're going to predict the number of people that they were exchanged for using regression based on and the number of abscesses at the clinic. So we have one measure of abscesses, our dependent variable, number of people that were being exchanged for. That is, people would indicate if they were exchanging for just themselves or themselves and other people. And we see just using regression, there was a significant relationship here, but we know that regression doesn't deal with the autocorrelations. We can see our residuals don't look so good. We see as we get further to the right of our residuals and fitted graph that we have a lot more spread in terms of our variables. We see some problems with normality. If we do an autocorrelation graph, we can see that with one, that the first autocorrelation is problematic. It's got a big value. Maybe not so many problems down the line, but we'll see how we can deal with this. I used ARIMA 1, 0, 0 here, adding in one autocorrelative term. And we can see that the problems disappear on the graph on the left. The graph on the right still has a problem with lag number 5, but unless there's a reason for me to think that there's going to be a 5-week gap, I'm just going to be okay with that. And then you can see from our output, we're predicting the number of people exchanged for, and we have a result that ends up non-significant. I have some code, some sample code in the lab that shows you how to get R to calculate these for you. So we can see the t-value is actually negative 1.59, which is not significant. So what we found is, at least for that measure, it wasn't significantly related to number of abscesses. Incidentally, if you go and you read the article, we had continued to collect data for many more weeks than for this example, and we actually did find out that the exchanges were related to abscesses. That investment up front was something that would eventually save the clinic money. All right, we can also do time series with multiple predictors, just like moving from simple regression to multiple regression. We just add predictors. These are data that are similar to what's in the homework assignment. And these data test what's called the heat hypothesis. That's the idea that hot temperatures increase aggressive behaviors. The authors of the study had data from 1950 to 1995 that had a number of measures of aggression, but one was serious and deadly assaults. And it was predicted from the average temperature. That was their variable of interest. It was predicted from year because assaults were rising every year. And it was also predicted by average age of the population, because it tends to be younger people, in particular younger men, that would commit these serious and deadly assaults. Changes in the average age over those years would be substantially related to, potentially related to the number of serious and deadly assaults. So the basic idea here is that they're testing over and above the effects of year, over and above the effects of age, whether temperature relates to serious and deadly assaults. All right, just to show you, this is my final model, and this is from a published paper. It's by Anderson and a few other folks. Something that you'll be looking into for one of the homework assignments. I think homework assignment number 4. My final model I ended on was an ARIMA 3.300. You can see I still have a problem on the 4th lag, fourth lag is just okay, and then the 9th lag is a problem, but that's not a big deal. You'll see that the authors of this article handled it a little bit differently than I would have. I might have added another autoregressive component just to get at that 4th one, but they landed on 3, so that's where I'm landing. And you can see with the output here, we see that age has a age has a t-value of 1.07. What I've bolded here are the values for temperature, because that was what was of most interest, 2.3, and then year, t-value of around 11. When we go down to the probabilities, the next line down, we can see age has a 0.28 value, meaning it wasn't significant. Temperature, 0.019 and all that other stuff, so that was significant. And then year, we can see year was highly significant, was well below that 0.05 level. In terms of how the authors wrote this up, temperature relates to serious and deadly results. Serious and deadly assaults, I should say, after accounting for 3 autoregressive predictors: year, age shift, and year, age shift, and hotter years related to increased assaults. So you can see the different components there. Again, really just the coefficient and the probability being presented. All right, other resources for time series. I've posted the Lab 6 review, so you can review it to see how I did various analyses. Handout 8 covers these topics in a good bit of more detail than was handled here, than I've presented here. Also, I encourage you, if you want extra practice, definitely work on the problems that are in the lab assignment. They're there for your practice. Or you can just jump right to the homework assignment. Keep in mind, myself and Danielle will be available as much as we can to help with homework. Definitely keep in contact with us, because we're not going to be in class together. All right, that's it for this first video. Thank you for tuning in, or whatever. All right, be well, everybody. Wash your hands.